Alright everybody, welcome to part 4 of the Maya fish modeling tutorial. So far we've modeled our fish, we've UV'd it and textured it, and the last part of it that we're going to focus on in this part is rigging it and putting a little bit of animation on it. Very simple. So first thing you want to do is set your project, make sure if it's not already done. Mine is done too. Once you set your project, just open the scenes and look for the last one that you worked on. In this case should be the video textured model. And this should pop up. You have your fish that you worked on last time with the softer edges to make it a little bit nicer. And again, that's an optional feature. You don't have to do it, but as you can see, it looks a lot nicer. First thing we're going to do is we're pretty much done with the reference image back here, so we don't need to keep it around, or at least make it visible. We can always keep it around, it's not going to hurt. So I'm just going to hide it and call this reference image layer. And it's important that you name it layer or something different. The reason is if you for whatever reason name this reference image over here, Maya doesn't like to have an object and a layer with the same name. It's also good practice to name everything. So just so it's hidden, that way it's out of the way. And first thing we're going to do is make sure everything's named so we know where all the things are. Sometimes you might need to use it specifically, so in this case we're just going to leave it like this. And then we're going to make this into a group. Oops, sorry. We're going to make this into a group. So select everything that is the fish, not the image plane. If you want to make it easier, just select that. And then just hit Control G. That's going to make a group out of it. We're going to call this fish poly group. And we're also going to attach it to a layer because we want to lock some components in a bit. So you're going to hover over here, create new layer, and assign selected objects. That's the fish. And we're going to call it fish geometry. Let's call it fish poly for polygons. Fish poly layer. Okay, and we're going to lock that. We're going to lock that. And the reason is we don't want to click the geometry. We're about to put bones in, so we don't really want to mess with stuff too much. We don't want to be able to move vertices independently or anything. So we'll just leave it at that. And again, this is the very simple fish skeleton and rigging that we're going to do. The idea is not even to look realistic, it's just to have some limited movement. So for that, we're going to turn on shading and make sure X-ray joints are on. That way when we add the joints, we can actually see them. And we're going to go to the side view. If you want to see the pretty fish on the side view, just hit 6. You don't need to. We're going to turn on shading, X-ray joints here so we can actually see the joints if you don't have that already. And we're going to change our modeling tab to rigging, and we're going to hit rigging right here so we can have a few tools. So before we start, if we go to object mode, just to show you real quick, you don't want any history on your fish in case you didn't do it before. Hit edit, delete all by type, history. And we want to start this fresh. We want our fish to be at 0, everything about our group to be at 0, and we don't want any kind of history on our fish. We're going to lock that back up. Alright, so we're going to start building some skeletons, or a skeleton. So if you hover over here, it says create joints. That's where we're going to do our first joint there. You can also go under here to skeleton, create joints, and you'll get this like crosshair. And basically we're just going to start laying out the joints. I'm going to find somewhere near the front here to make my first joint. And this is called the root joint. And the idea is that wherever your root joint, that's kind of like the base of the fish or where it's starting. Um, it's different for humans and different animals. For humans, it would probably be like your hip bone like area near your um, like the center of your body, and that's kind of where all the rest of the body kind of stems from. But for this model, we're just going to do like a straight chain, nothing crazy. So starting there, that's going to be your joint 1. We're going to rename these later. While holding shift, just move to the next position and put another joint. The more joints you add, the more flexibility your fish can have if you animate it as such. But in this case, we're only going to add a few. So I want one joint for the base, one joint to control the like the head, and one joint to control kind of the middle of the fish. And then I'm going to add a few more joints here in case I ever really want to. While holding shift, you're doing this by the way. Holding shift between them, that way it keeps it in a straight line. I'm going to add like 4 here and here. Okay. And it's very important that at this point you don't rotate any of your joints. You want to keep them straight in the direction they're at. The reason is they have a direction that they face. As you see, what this one that's selected, X, Y, Z. We want Y to be up, standard for now. So if you rotate anywhere, it'll add history and it'll kind of mess with it. So your fish will always be tilted one direction if you don't do this right. So all you did was draw a line of bones using the bone tool. And once you have that selected, I'm going to hit W for the move tool. And I want to move some of these around just so they're not perfectly in a straight line, especially back here. It's kind of the lower side. The idea is to kind of encompass the middle of the fish. The kind of skinning we're going to do, again, very simple. It needs to be somewhere near the middle of the fish. We do this in a perspective view, and not in the, or sorry, we do this in a side view or a orthographic view, not a perspective view, so that everything kind of centers. If you do it in the perspective 3D view, it'll go kind of anywhere. It won't be perfectly straight down the middle line. So we just want to work on the side so we know what we're doing here. I like how the first one's faced. I'm actually going to move it up a bit. But if you just move it right now, the whole chain is going to go along with it. I don't want that. I want to just move the top one a little bit higher. So to do that, you're going to hold D. Or just press D actually, it'll activate it. So once you hold D, it'll let you kind of move it without affecting the rest of the chain. You can move the individual unit rather than follow the parenting standards. This second one is kind of in the center like that. This one's also centered. This one's a little high, so I'm going to bring it down. Again, hit D to move it. Just going to bring it down a little bit. This one I'm happy with. This one I'm going to move up. And if you leave D select, like D, you don't undo the D. Next time you check, it'll go back up. It'll stay selected and let you move it around. Oh, nope. Okay, so I'm happy with that. It's not a perfect line, but it's kind of in the center of the face here, center of the body, body, somewhat center of the body, and then this one's maybe a little bit higher. Yeah, looks a lot nicer. Cool. It's okay to have some translate history. Not going to really affect anything. It's all good. So once you have that line straight there, we're going to name these. Instead of doing it one by one, what you should do is just hit shift on the first one and it'll open everything up for you. So as you see, it'll select the first one. We're going to call this root joint, fish root joint. You might have different models in the scene, so you want to be specific. Fish root joint. Fish spine 1. Fish spine 2. Fish underscore spine 3. And you kind of get the idea, just keep going. And in a more complex model, you would use different names and spines. This is a whole spine for me, so it just kind of makes sense to keep calling it as such. If you were to create different bones for, like, let's say the fins back here, you would call it accordingly. But in this case, we're just focusing on the spine right now. Fish, spine, 4, oh, 5, don't call the same thing. Fish, spine, 6. In class, I think I only did 5 spines. That's okay if you have that. I just added an extra one on here just to give it a little bit more flexibility if I want to. Okay. And once you have the spines done, we're going to skin this guy. So first select the joints. Shift select the fish poly group, polygons. If you have anything in between those two, don't shift select. Just select the joints first and then do control. Select fish poly group. And then we're going to go to skin and bind skin. Don't hit bind skin. We're going to go to the options. And I'm going to reset this in case you don't have it that looks like this. What you want to do is bind to joint hierarchy. The binding method, instead of closest distance, we're going to go geodesic voxel. And we're basically going to leave everything else the same. Most of these settings are pretty good. The higher the resolution, the better it is. If you have a faster computer, do 512. If not, yeah, I have a pretty fast computer. I'm going to do 1024. But you can leave it at 256, 512. It's basically going to let you control parts of your fish differently. The higher the quality is, the resolution, the better quality you'll have. Meaning this bone in the middle here of the fish is not going to control the top over here. The higher that number is, the less likelihood of that happening. But again, it takes a toll on performance. If you're running like a MacBook Air or something like that, don't do it on that. And then just make sure you save your project before we do this. So file, save as, save scene as, and we're going to call this fish video tutorial rigging or rigging. Save, continue. Cool. And happy with that, I'm going to hit bind skin. And it's going to process here for a bit. Again, if you do the standard 256, that's going to be a little bit better, or a little bit faster. I know my computer can handle it, so I'm using a little bit higher to see if it makes it a little bit better. Cool. Everything should be set here. You can leave these translates as they are. We're not really messing with, we're never moving these in this manner, so we don't have to worry about that. But you can kind of test to see how it worked. And just make sure you hit undo every time you rotate. So hit E for the rotate tool to test. And you can see the fish is moving there, everything around it. You can test the next one. Oh yeah, it's looking a lot nicer. And always make sure it's 0 before you go on to the next one. You don't want to leave your fish half moving. It's looking pretty good to me. Typically, there is an additional step after you do this. You want to paint the weights and make sure that everything's properly distributed. But for the sake of time in this project, we're not going to do that. So we're going to leave it as this. To me, it looks good enough. So we're going to leave it. And we're just going to hit edit, delete all by type, non-deformer history. Do not hit history. If you hit history, it will break your rig and you have to redo this whole process for the rigging. If you do non-deformer history, it'll just be any kind of like translation, any other things that you did to it. But what's cool is that right now you can actually select your bones, right? That's why you have the fish poly locked. If you unlock it, you can actually select it. You don't want to do that, and once you have like a rig done, you can bring this into Unity or any other game engine, and you'll be able to do some stuff with it, but we want to create some controls so that we can animate manually. The easy way to animate is just to hit this and turn and hit set. But you don't really want to put a lot of history on here, and you want to create some controllers. Every professional studio that uses digital rigs, they have a kind of like a puppet system to control it. So we're going to create a very simple version of that. And to do that, we just have to go to curved surfaces instead of polygon modeling, and we're going to create a nerve circle. And that'll kind of spawn in the middle of your scene here. And we're going to scale it first, diagonally. And we're going to go to right click, control vertex, and select the corner vertices. This is more of an aesthetic preference. You don't have to do this. But the idea of this is to be able to, oops, that's not what I want to do. Hit object, get out of it. And I'm just creating a lattice just so I can see kind of a direction of where the fish is headed. Rather than seeing a circle, if like the fish is really far away, I can kind of see, well, it's kind of facing it this way or that way. Just kind of helps you narrow it down. And for that, before we do anything else to it, we're going to do edit. We're actually going to keep this lattice selected and go to modify freeze transformations, and that's going to zero out every adjustment that we just did. You never want to leave those, because we're basically going to parent the entire fish to this lattice here, so that when we move this lattice, the fish goes along with it. And if we turn it, you get the idea. Okay, so next thing, we're going to create another nerves curve, and we're going to scale it big. And in this case, to move this over here, yeah, I'm fine with this. Just leave it in the center for now. Let's get a little bit bigger than the other one. And the idea of this one is this is going to control like the animation on the fish that we're going to do, which is the flapping of the back tail. And again, it's going to be very simple, very rudimentary, but it gives you a lot of control. If you want to make a more advanced rig of this, you can. Just add multiple circles. Okay, so now we start parenting stuff. So before we do that, we want to change the names of these things. So this is going to be the main controller, fish main controller, fish main controller, and the circle one's going to be the fish tail controller. Okay, and it's tail A-I-L, not A-L-E. Saw some of those during grading. Cool. So we want to parent the controller here to the root joint. So you're going to select the fish main controller, and then you're going to hit fish root joint, and you're going to hit constraint and parent. And we're going to test that. When you hit W to move, fish moves along. When you hit E to rotate, fish rotates. However, it's not going to scale. If you try to scale, it's going to change all sorts of things, so don't mess with it. And then we're going to select this one here before we forget, and I want to zero these out. So modify freeze transforms on the circle. Okay, so now that this one is constrained to the fish itself, like the whole body, we want to control the back from spine 3 basically with the circle. So select the circle, make sure it's zeroed out, fishtail controller, we're going to control, click fish spine 3, and we're going to do the exact same thing. We're going to do constraint, parent. And if you test it by selecting the fish controller, hit E, and when you turn, fish flops. Super simple. There are ways to kind of control D so that it's more of a smooth movement. We're not going to really bother with in this particular example. All right. So now that you have this here controlling the tail, and this here controlling the fish itself, you can tell that there's something wrong here. It's like, oh no, the fish, it's separate. We're going to parent, uh, we're going to make the lattice the overall parent as the main controller for the entire fish. And instead of parenting it, we're just going to drop the fishtail controller under the fish main controller. And when you do that, if you rotate this guy, the whole fish rotates. But if you rotate this guy, just the tail rotates. And with that, we're mostly done. There's only one last thing we have to do. Remember the problem with scaling? We couldn't scale before. So it's wrong to move the geometry. You never want to move the geometry because you want to put all the animation into controller, not the geometry itself. You could move it here, but it kind of messes with stuff. Don't want to do it. So don't touch the poly group. That's locked. You don't want to mess with it. So what you want to do is you want to select the fish main controller and the fish group joint and hit Control or Command in Apple G. And that's going to group those two together. When you do that, rename that fish scale group. And when you select that, it's kind of it lets you scale the whole fish together. That way, if you ever need to make it bigger or smaller in a different Maya scene, you can do it without affecting any of the animations we have or anything like that. All right. And from this point, there's certain things you can hide. You can do shading, X-ray joins. We don't really need the joins anymore. That way we can see the fish. I want to hide this real quick. And we can kind of control our fish from there. We can give it some movement if we need to. And we can give it some a little bit of animation to make it flop around and swim maybe. And we're done with this part. Bring these things back together. I'm going to do edit, delete all by type, non-deformer history. Just I really like to keep my history clean. And I'm going to file, save as, fish tutorial, rigged, fish tutorial rig. And this is kind of my final project, my final file. I tend to save stuff my ASCII. Some of you have binary. I like ASCII a little bit better, and not really important, but in this case, there's some uses for it. Fish tutorial rig. So for me, anytime I call something rig, that's like the puppet. That's the one I want to work with. So I'm going to save as that, and that's why I want to delete all history and all that stuff. So once we're done with that, you're kind of ready to go. We just have to animate. So from now, we're going to do this part of, oh geez, so many emails. So popular today. To make the animation, it's going to be pretty simple. We're going to focus on just making the tail move. That's really it. We're going to do like basically a looping animation. As far as Maya goes, just again, go over some of the basics. We can switch to animation here and animation here. I don't really use any of these tools. I'm sure they're useful, but I don't use them. I go mostly through the menus up here. That's what I'm comfortable with. So for this, I can hide the outliner because I don't really need it either. And I'm going to use the channel box. I'm going to leave that up. So your timeline here, you can select the frames basically that you're going to animate in. It's just like any timeline on any like video editing app or anything like that. Everything you see is a frame. And frames go from 1 to whatever you want to make it. In this case, 120 is what it's set to. And every 24 frames per second, which is the standard that Maya starts at. And to check that, when you go to Window, Settings, Preferences, and under Settings, you'll see that your overall units that you're working with is centimeter. That's a standard angular degrees instead of radians. And the time is 24 frames per second. So I like that look. 24 frames per second is like what movies are shot in. So I'm going to stick with that. If you do 30, 60, you're going to get a lot smoother motion. Not going to worry about that. When I animate, I really like setting my tangents to stepped. So the standard thing that's on, I think it's auto, default out tangents under the, so just in case you get lost, Windows, settings, preferences, animation. The default, where it says rotation, interpolation, nope, sorry, tangents. Default out tangents is set to auto typically, or linear or something like that. I like to use stepped. And basically stepped ensures that you can use keyframes. Keyframes are like the most important keys, and Maya is going to fill in the in-betweens later. So I'm going to put to stepped, and I'm going to save that. And before we start animating, I'm going to set how much animation I'm going to do. So again, I'm going to keep this super simple. I'm going to do 48 frames, which is 2 seconds of animation. And you can see the numbers here go from frame 1 to frame 48. And the idea is that we're going to set different keys here. So I'm going to go every 12 keys. I'm going to set one key. And to do that, all we're going to do is select our fishtail controller. And on frame 1, which is the first frame, we're going to hit S. And S sets the key. You're going to see a red line pop up, and that means it's set. You're also going to see on the channel box, all the different metrics are going to be at 0. In this case, if we didn't move anything, but you're going to see a red line come up. When you move around, it's going to look pink. Pink means that you have animation somewhere in your on this object that you're moving, but in this case, it's not a specific frame. But then when you land on a frame that is animated, it'll be bright red. So the reason we're doing 1, 0 is because we want our fish to kind of loop in animation. And we want our first loop to be at 1, and our last loop to be at 47. And the idea is that if you think about a 360 move, actually, no, we're not doing a turntable in this guy. So we're going to use 48. So we're going to go to 48 is going to be our last move. And our last move should be also 0, so that it loops on. Okay. So at 0, 0, we're going to set one at 48 as well. Okay. Then we're going to go to 12. And I'm simply going to move the side. I'm going to do something not so extreme that it looks really fake. I'm going to do 40. It's going to go the other way. That's a little extreme if you look at it from the top. Let's do 30. That's passable. Okay, so 30 degrees essentially. I like that. So at 0, 30, I'm going to hit set. As long as it's selected, the controller, it's going to set it in the right place. From 12, we're going to go to 24, and we're going to go back to 0. So we're just going to 0 that out. We're going to set it. And at 36, we're going to go negative 30, because it's going to go the other way. And we're going to hit S to set it. And again, 48, we had done 0, so we're good to go. And you can hit play here, and you'll see it'll just kind of go. Those are the key frames. So it doesn't look very realistic. It kind of snaps to place. It's not super smooth. So in order to correct that, if you haven't done so, now it's a good time to save. Hit Control. Before you save, actually, File, Save As, and we're going to call this Fish Tutorial Animation Test. Since it's not a specific animation that I'm doing, I just like to call it test if I'm just playing around. Save, continue. In order to make this motion look a lot smoother, we're just going to switch those animations from step tangents to just linear. That way they don't slow down or anything. So you do playback speed. If you haven't done this already or yours says something different, put real time. That'll make it so it actually plays in real time. Otherwise it plays kind of funky. And you're going to go where it says tangents, and instead of stepped, you're going to put linear. And when you hit play, you see a lot smoother motion. And essentially that's how you animate literally everything in Maya. You use controllers to move things around, move bones around, and then you save your animation to those controllers.